Sarah Mudrick earned her Master's of Science degree from in education, excuse me, that's right. Sarah Mudrick earned her Master's of Science in Education from Johns Hopkins School of Education and has been teaching in Hawaii for 5 years. She was born and raised in Honolulu, just like I was, and she is passionate about cultivating local leadership and empowering students in Hawaii. She joined SafeTech in 2021 and has created a unit to educate students on wireless radiation and engage them in local advocacy, writing to their county council members to stop the proliferation of towers near homes and schools. So Sarah was actually able to get all her students to write to her local county members about this issue. She has engaged students from middle to high school in this unit and is passionate about getting students to unplug and realize the addictive nature of their tech reliance. So let's welcome Sarah to the stage. And I'm gonna mic you up real quick.
As Ian introduced me, I am an educator. I teach English to grades right now 9, 10, 11, 12, but I've also taught middle school, 7th and 8th as well. So I've titled this presentation, Zapped, Examining Classrooms and Students in the Digital Age. So what I'd like to cover today is my introduction to this issue. It's a little bit different than all our previous speakers. I'd also like to talk about kids these days, what the internet does to our brains, and also share what some schools are doing around the world in the United States as well to address this issue. And lastly, share my unit that I created that I've run with students 7th through 12th grade. Awesome. So my introduction. Well, I was in 8th grade in 2010. And in 2018, I was back in the classroom, but this time I was teaching 8th grade. And I figured, how different could it be, really? I was here less than 10 years ago, but I was definitely in for a shock. So one of the big things that woke me up to this issue was 8th graders throwing full-on tantrums if I took their phone because they weren't concentrating, weren't paying attention, like talking elementary level, like crying, like screaming, like can barely get their words out, like angry. And I was just so shocked, like could barely speak. So that was the first huge moment that I was like, something is different with these kids than was 10 years ago when I was in this same position. The next thing I noticed was students just trying to live stream anything, literally anything. Like, well, we're watching a movie in class and they just want to live stream their face, right? Not even the movie, just their face, just their reaction. And that was just mind-blowing for me. On the those are more non-academic side, but on the more academic side, I also experienced a huge shift in what I felt I should be able to expect of my students. Even just remembering things from day to day. Like we literally covered this yesterday. At first I thought maybe it's just me, English is not always the most exciting, they're just bored or something. But that was my first year teaching, so as I continued on in the profession, spoke to my principals. While I was working at my first school, we had like a swap, so the high school vice principal swapped with our principal. And even from the high school, they're saying they're noticing the same issue from year to year, that students are just not remembering things from year to year. Huge systemic issue, even starting in elementary. And essentially, at my school, 7th and 8th grade English was almost exactly the same. Like all the topics were the same. And still yet, when my 8th graders were coming to my classroom, it's like they never heard of those things before. So, another huge shift that I was noticing was extreme high levels of self-reported depression, anxiety. One student in particular that I really struggled with would just refuse to do anything remotely close to sharing with the class. Just like even a sentence, like, what did you do today? No. And her mother supported this, her not developing any public speaking skill because of her anxiety. Which I thought was such a shame. And eventually, I came to realize that even though I was only in school 10 years ago, the landscape of academics has completely shifted. There's no homework anymore. I'm a high school teacher, and I can tell you, you can graduate high school now never having done an assignment outside of the classroom. And there's lots of opinions on homework, and we're not going to get into that, but that is one of the huge things that I've noticed. Class periods are getting shorter and shorter. I teach high school, and my periods are only 46 minutes, which seems impossibly short. There are no notes, there are no binders, there's nothing to even write anything down. Students don't know how to take notes. Everything is 100% now on the Chromebooks, on the iPads. And it is such a constant battle to get these kids to put their phones away, take out the AirPods. Even when my school has recently kind of beefed up about this issue, we're just so sneaky, like putting the hoods up, putting the hair, just any way to get that music in, like so distractible. All right, and worst of all, I would say, is expecting students even as young as preschool to be adept on the iPad, turning in their work via a picture instead of, the hard copy, especially during the pandemic. That was such a shift. And in particular, my concern is often using the iPad as a reward. So especially with students that can be, a bit more challenging, this is oftentimes part of their behavioral plan, is that if they do what they're supposed to do, then they get their iPad time. So we are reinforcing this already highly addictive technology even more so. As you know, we've stopped teaching cursive to make time for more technical education. This is not reduced at all. And part of this reasoning, really disturbingly, is also a push from our tech companies, right, to provide that access to get those computers, iPads, whatever have you, into the classroom to so-called make themselves look good, provide that access, that kind of thing. So this led me down my own rabbit hole, trying to figure out what happened. I really wasn't in school that long ago. I would share these things with my parents, and my parents would say, well, every generation, says that about the last. And I would say, but what if it's true, right? What if it's true that every generation we are getting more distracted, more forgetful, less committed, more immature? Where does this leave us in the 2020s, right? So are these kids really that different? I saw this wonderful Time magazine cover to really demonstrate that. And now before I answer this, I want to fully acknowledge that many people in this group might put me into this generation, right, that I'm talking about. I was born in 1996. A lot of the research that I'm going to cover is by Dr. Jean Twenge, and she titles this generation Gen Z, or iGen, the internet generation, and she starts that line at 1995. So technically, I would fall into this category based on her description. However, generational lines are more of a gradation than a solid line. And while I do associate with some of the Gen Z character traits, I also do associate with a lot of millennial character traits. And I would say that there is enough of a generational divide where some of the differences between myself and my students are hard for me to reconcile. So I'm coming at this explanation from this space, acknowledging that I am part of these generation as well. But although we are so close in age, generations are actually getting shorter. So whereas before we measured generations for about a marker of 25 years, now we're looking at more 15 years. So take that for what you will. So how many of you have young people my age or younger in your life?
How old are you?
I'm 27. I just turned 27 last week. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, so hopefully some of what I will share is either validating for you, or if it's not, you can give yourself a pat on the back that your young people are not like this. All right, so short answer, yes. Our young people are markedly different in many ways, and I'd like to talk about a few of them. And the research I'd like to focus on is by Dr. Jean Twenge. She's published multiple books. She studies generations. And as I mentioned, she terms this generation Gen Z iGen. So I'll use that interchangeably, but basically my age. And goes into the expected traits that we can expect using longitudinal studies, which allows us to compare generations across time, meaning I can look at an 18-year-old in 1980 and compare that to an 18-year-old today. All right, so nearly all of her conclusions tie back to one central theme: the effects of living your entire life through your phone. And I, among others, would like to argue on top of this that these generational markers can also be tied back to EMF exposure. All right, so Exhibit 1. You might have remembered this in the news, but around 2015, 2016, there was a huge blow up of all these phones exploding. The main one I remember was in the airplane. But another one that made the news that I guess I missed at the time was blowing up in children's beds, particularly when they had been sleeping with them underneath their pillow and waking up to it being on fire, right? So the bedmate of our Gen Z, the first bedmate, is these phones, right? They willingly admit to sleeping with their phones, if not underneath their pillow, in their bed. The farthest is just arm's reach away. Maybe they'll put it on their bedside table, but because the first thing that they do when they wake up in the morning is reach for that phone, and as they're falling asleep, they're also scrolling social media, the internet, what have you. And also, if they wake up in the middle of the night, they'll likely check their phone to get them back to sleep. And young people, my students included, describe these behaviors similarly to how an addict would, right? Like, I know I shouldn't do it, but I just can't help it, right? So kids these days, what's happening with them? This is the book that I've been referencing. And the generational shifts that I'm about to present to you are across all economic and ethnic groups, regardless of gender, religion, and the type of town in which the respondents grew up. And that's especially significant because iGen, representing 24% of the country's population, is the most ethnically diverse generation in history. So the title of this book is iGen: Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and What That Means for the Rest of Us. These kids have never known a time before the internet. So that's something I like to start with, is like, I'm older than the internet sometimes when I'm getting to know them. Dr. Twenge describes their development using a sociological term, growing up slowly. So this is where people will have one child and spend a lot of time nurturing them rather than have many children and having more of a focus on like getting through the day and surviving with their pack. This slows the maturation process, and Dr. Twenge has posited that we can think of it as a difference of 3 years. So meaning today's graduating 18-year-olds, my seniors just graduated yesterday, and I love them to death, but I have to say, I do agree that much of their maturity level is that more of a 15-year-old than an 18-year-old. One of the key themes that Twenge returns to again and again is their obsession with safety. So Gen Z is risk averse and less likely to engage with risky behaviors. So now you might think, isn't that a good thing? And I would argue yes, but the reason behind it, I would say, is not good. Rather than truly being concerned for safety in the purest sense, the reason I feel this generation is so concerned with safety is due to the fact that everything is mediated through their phone. Before they ever experience something in real life, they'll likely Google it, watch a few videos or TikToks about it, listen to an influencer about it, read some reviews maybe, and then maybe try it in real life, right? Learn from other people's mistakes or faux pas. Not only is Gen Z risk averse, but they also actively fear adulthood and make statements about wanting to revert, right? You might have heard of the term adulting, right? Adulting sucks. But this is quite a reversal of what we've seen in previous generations where kids just can't wait to grow up, right? As a result, we can see with this longitudinal data that I generalize more heavily on their parents until they are much older than previous generations. They date and have sex at older ages. They get driver's licenses later, usually only after their parents refuse to drive them around for any longer. They get their first jobs later. Again, the term growing up slowly. Twenge also shares that more so than previous generations, iGen exhibits higher levels of individualistic values and beliefs. And again, I would say mediated through the phone, right? Also, as a side note, teen pregnancy is at an all-time low. And again, date and have sex later, but also, as Deborah mentioned earlier, perhaps in some part, we are seeing the effects of lowered sperm count and less motility as well. So, while others might present it as a symptom, I present this as the cause to all the behaviors I just covered, that the fact that all the experiences of these young people are mediated through social media and the internet rather than a person. And as a result, this generation is often lonely and sad and participate less in activities that are proven to reduce depression, like spending time with other people, spending time outside. They're also tired. I hope we all remember fatigue is one of the effects of EMFs, right? But beyond just being physically tired, just emotionally tired, like very over it, I would say. It doesn't seem like anything really matters. School doesn't really matter. They are hyper aware of the abysmal state of the world, and it all just weighs on them, I would say. So, how much time are they really spending online? Dr. Twenge terms this new media. So new media is texting, being on your phone, being on the internet, playing video games, all this type of stuff like after the TV, right? So this graph shows how many hours a day a young person would engage with each of these activities. So to truly get a picture, we should add all these numbers. And thankfully, Dr. Twenge has already done that, the math for me, and posits that the average iGener spends between 5 to 6 hours a day on new media. So factoring in all the other things that you need to be a person, like go to school, sleep, all of that, this is essentially 100% of their leisure time, right? They are not spending time in any of the other ways that previous generations did. This does not include TV watching, but another generational shift is that TV watching is kind of in the background now. It's just like background noise that students or children are most likely multitasking, so that's not really their center of attention. And if we factor in TV, it would add up to over 24 hours in a day. So that's really why. All right, and again, I didn't mention this book was published pre-pandemic, so I would assume these numbers are only higher now. This holds true across gender, race, or socioeconomic background, which is what this graph shows. And while girls tend to gravitate more towards social media, boys will opt to spend nearly the same amount of time, if not more, on video games, although the time spent playing video games by girls is also increasing. So that's a lot of time each day to spend on your phone. So what are they doing less of? And essentially, the answer is everything that we used to do to communicate and entertain ourselves. So as I mentioned, kids spend less time with their friends in person. They're less likely to go to parties or be unsupervised at the mall or in other activities with their friends. They're more likely to invite their parents. They're less likely to go on dates or even talk to friends face-to-face at school rather than mediate that friend interaction through their phone, like look what's on my TikTok type of deal. They go outside less. They are getting less exercise. There's been, I'm an ELA teacher one more time, there's been a tremendous decline in reading for pleasure, whereas the majority of teens in the 70s read for pleasure. In 2015, that number is at 16%, saying that they've read one book in the past year for pleasure. And again, I'm sure it's even lower now. So beyond reading for pleasure, Gen Z is less likely to read, period. Whether it's assigned for school or not, as a high school teacher, I can attest to this. I read aloud books to my high schoolers to get them to read it. And in Twangie's book, she also cites college-level students not reading their required texts simply due to not having that reading practice when they enter college, and they just can't handle it. Some might argue that, well, we put a lot of pressure on kids these days. They're probably preparing for their college or whatever, right? But actually, they are doing less homework and less extracurricular activities. And here in Hawaii, I can 100% guarantee you that is far less homework than as little as 10 years ago. And like I said earlier, you can fully graduate high school without ever doing work outside of class if you apply yourself. All right. Others might also think that this generation, very individualistic, also materialistic. Maybe they want to get jobs, right? They want to work after school, they want to get that money, but that's also not the case, whereas previous generations might have got a summer job or an after-school job. We're seeing far less of that, and even far less even wanting to get a summertime job. And again, as I mentioned earlier, iGen is less likely to want to drive and get a driver's license right at 16, making the classic teen trope of spending time driving around essentially obsolete. So what's the result? Teens are lonelier, more depressed, more anxious than previous generations, as you can see in this graph. With an all-time high, again, this is pre-pandemic levels because that's just where our research is at, with satisfaction, this one is I feel lonely and left out with an all-time high in 2015. And this is satisfaction with yourself and your life as a whole hitting an all-time low in 2014. And the key year here that I tend to look at is 2012. So 2012 was the year that a lot of social media became available on smartphones, and by this time, the majority of Americans already had a smartphone. All right, sadly, statistics that are really hard to argue with is suicide rates, which are clear markers of worsening mental health. And here we can see a dramatic uptick right at that year I mentioned, 2012, in adolescent suicide, self-poisoning, major depressive episodes, and depressive symptoms right here at that 2012 mark. All right, so there are no shortage of articles discussing all of these reasons that I've previously mentioned for why American teens are so sad. Social media, lack of in-person socializing, the stressors of the modern world, and modern parenting also tending towards coddling. Another great book worth checking out is called The Coddling of the American Mind. I highly recommend it. It talks about a lot of the same things I'm covering right now. But few in the mainstream have questioned the link between EMFs and the health effect on teens. So thankfully, some are now putting this together, and their reputable research can be found online a lot easier than it was even a few years ago. And this one I'm citing here, Dr. Paul, shares the number of studies that have correlated neuropsychiatric symptoms with appearing following EMF exposure. And again, this list lines up eerily well with all these generational traits that I've just mentioned, including depression, trouble with concentration, attention, and memory changes. All right, so to recap real quick, we know that psychologically and on the mental health side, phones and social media have a negative effect on youth. I hope we can now all agree that health-wise, EMF exposure is linked to multiple neuropsychiatric effects, as well as the myriad of diseases that Deborah mentioned earlier today. But I was also curious, does constantly being online change the way we think and process information? Does it change the way we organizationally and operationally move through our life, like it seems to have done with iGen? And for me, a hyper obsession with safety and living life through your phone eventually makes us less human. So if we are constantly operating through the internet, does that make us operate more like a computer as well? So thankfully, there's another excellent book that I was able to turn to and get my questions answered. And again, sadly, the short answer is yes. I brought this book here today. So in The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, Nicholas Carr discusses the major shifts in communication that we've experienced as a society, but argues that the internet is unique in changing our ability to process information and the way that we think. We have hard evidence showing that the way we read on a screen differs greatly from the way we read books. When you read a web page, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, we tend to skim, scan, skip, scroll, click another link. Oh, maybe we bumped an ad, or we bumped that ad on purpose, open another window, maybe open another desktop if we have another idea. All of which means more distraction, less deep reading and comprehension. We've become browsers and word spotters rather than deep readers. And this is hugely problematic, especially when we expect young people to be adept at using the internet productively, which is what we're expecting in school right now, when they never really developed that deep reading practice in the first place, right? It's hard enough for adults to deep read on a screen. How can we expect children to do the same? This is one of the many problems that I feel relying fully on technology in the classroom is creating, and far too few educators are warning the alarm bells, in my opinion. Furthermore, we're actually getting worse at solving problems as more and more advanced software aids us in more and more ways. And this is where I'd love to go on a huge tangent about ChatGPT. As Deborah mentioned, 5G should really be called AI, or the Internet of Things infrastructure. And AI tools being free and available to students are just helping us on our way to that reality. But that is a subject for another talk, so we will save that for next time. So similarly, while reading Twangy's book, she had another great study that they took a screenshot of the college student's computer every 5 seconds. And they determined that college students, while working on a computer, switch between tasks every 19 seconds. And on average, that computer window is open less than a minute. So this is not the deep reading and introspective thought that used to define the college experience. And really quick, is it any wonder that there is a meteoric rise in ADHD rates in young people? As Knowable magazine readily admits, it is likely higher diagnosed than what is really the true prevalence, but just how much of this is influenced by iGen being raised by the internet, smartphones, and social media. So what are schools doing about it, you might be wondering? So in my experience across 5 years at 3 different schools in Hawaii, I was the only teacher raising this issue. And especially since the pandemic, school has universally shifted onto devices, right? With everything being mediated through Google Classroom, the entire Department of Education in Hawaii subscribes to Google Suites. That means all of our sensitive student information is all available to Google, right? All of this work that teachers are doing, in my opinion, we are training the AI in this moment to be teaching students, but again, that is an issue for another time. Yes. Unless you elect to take things offline, like I myself have done, and even then, it is hard to get students to complete it that way, right? Especially with them all hating their handwriting because we didn't spend the time to teach it in 3rd grade. But in America, it seems that the wealthiest private schools are aware of these issues, as well as some being aware of the EMF issue. And one example I like to use is the Waldorf schools, which prohibit technology use until the older level grades of high school, and even direct parents in their parent handbook that the ideal amount of tech time for developing children is none. And the best part is that Waldorf schools are notorious for educating the children of Silicon Valley executives. But as we've been saying throughout today, it is not hopeless. There are some quite inspiring cases in other countries across the world, so I'd just like to share a few. Multiple presentations today have mentioned the Environmental Health Trust, and I highly suggest you check out that website. All of this information about schools is available on there with links to learn more. But real quickly, France has banned Wi-Fi in kindergarten, restricts Wi-Fi in school by having the wireless off as a default setting, and teachers have wired, not wireless computers for internet access. France has also banned cell phones in elementary and middle schools and started educating the public to reduce exposure. Similarly, Cyprus has likewise removed Wi-Fi from elementary classrooms and has a strong public awareness campaign educating parents, teenagers, and pregnant women about the dangers of EMF. Belgium has banned cell phones manufactured for young children and has also banned Wi-Fi in kindergartens of Ghent. And Israel has banned Wi-Fi in nursery schools, restricts Wi-Fi in elementary grades, and bans cell phones in the classroom. Israel also has a national institution educating on how to reduce cell phone radiation. So as I said, Environmental Health Trust has all these links and a few other countries if you are more interested. Here in the US, it's a slightly different picture. There's a lot of politics with school districts and all that type of stuff, which we are not going to get into today, but certain school districts are aware and taking steps to mitigate the issue, as well as certain US cities, while other cities and school districts are installing cell phone antennas right in their football fields and playgrounds, which I personally saw on Oahu. So now this takes me to my unit. As Ian mentioned earlier, during the pandemic, we both witnessed some really sneaky installation of cell towers, usually in the night, and then the next day, all of a sudden, they're there. It got to the point where I tried to count my towers on the way to work coming from central urban Honolulu to Kapolei, and I lost count around 100. And so I started taking pictures, trying to point them out to people, like, did you notice this? My mom, my coworkers, my friends. And then I decided it's time to take it to my students. So I wanted to make a unit. This unit has evolved over the few years that I've run it. It started with 7th graders, so it was a lot shorter. And then last year I did it with my high schoolers, and I've now settled on keeping it in my 10th grade ELA unit, which focuses on dystopian literature. So I thought it was a great place to plug it in there. And propaganda. So this is quite a huge topic, so I've settled it into the following stages. The first is knowledge building, then we measure our school environment, and importantly, the students' devices that they use on the daily, and if they want to bring anything from home. Then we consult with an expert. Dr. Green has so graciously Zoomed with my students multiple times to be our expert. Then we write a lab report to communicate our findings, and then finally cap it off with writing letters to send to our county council members advocating for no more cell towers to be installed near schools and residences. So there's a lot of ways to preface this unit, but I found the best way is to ask kids, how do you feel about your cell phone? And they will readily tell you that their cell phone is their bae, their girlfriend, their boyfriend. They can't live without it. It's better than any person in their life, right? So I like to start by showing Netflix's The Social Dilemma. I don't agree with all the points in that documentary, so I did edit it out a little just to condense it and keep it down. But it does a good job of laying the foundation of where we are now with big tech and especially big data. And the key takeaway I want to use from that film is that if the product is free, you are the product. And that is the biggest, like, for kids, right? Like, what? I thought it was just nothing, right? Last year, I also introduced another topic about smart cities after I also witnessed that R2-D2 camera following me around in downtown Honolulu over a winter break. I felt it starting, right? So I was like, guys, do you know what a smart city is? And so I introduced the topic of the Internet of Things. We took a look at the multiple real-world examples that are already popping up. If you've heard of Toyota's Woven City, another really controversial one is called The Wall. And this built a nice foundation to kind of understand what we're talking about when we talk about 5G infrastructure, wireless radiation infrastructure, and all of this would be necessary for a smart city as designed to operate properly. So this was just my little, what we did and now where we're going. I then take the time to try to show students what we're looking at, right? So this was my drive in Honolulu. This is the high school that I was just talking about, Kapolei. I think there was one more blocked by this tree, but I'm not sure. But here's an apparatus, here's an apparatus. This was all on my way to work, right? So when we're looking out in the wild, like, where are we spotting it, right? I then share some of the slides I've developed, which is kind of like everything we've gone over today, but really condensed for kids, just simplified for students. And of course, there's still always some skeptics, right? So I take some time to do a station activity, let them read some passages from a really great book that I wanted to bring today, but I couldn't find it this morning. I'm so sorry, but it's this one, Radiation Nation. It rhymes if you have trouble remembering, but it has really great you know, pictures of all the tumors. It's very compelling. So we do that station activity. And then lastly, as it's an English class, I always focus on the propaganda aspect of this issue to review the difference between the public messaging and the marketing terms versus what's the reality of the health impacts, just like our tobacco industry. So here are two commercials that I really like to use. The rollout of 5G with T-Mobile mimics exactly launching a nuke, right? With the two-man rule, two people need to turn their key at the same time. So I just asked them, why do you think? They mimicked that in the commercial. And of course they're doing it as a positive thing, right? Positively turning on this 5G, but what are they really doing? And this commercial is not from America, but it shows that with 5G, we are taking those steps into living our life in the metaverse, right? Living our life in augmented reality. And it shows that with 5G, you have all these fast download speeds, excuse me. You can play online really easily. And that's just a good commercial to look at to kind of preface everything. All right, so the biggest hit with students is always having them measuring their phones and devices. After, of course, measuring the classroom, their school-assigned Chromebooks, and then the outside environment. So once we find a spot outside that's kind of neutral, this was really challenging in Oahu, but at my school now it's quite easy. We just walk up the hill a little bit. We then measure our devices one by one, going through all the modes. So we first turn off everything and put it in airplane mode, and this is the students' phones with the model, and then down here is a tablet and an Apple Watch, so that's why not everything's filled in. Then we do just Bluetooth on, then just Wi-Fi on, then Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on, and then finally the full-blown regular mode, you turn it with the cell towers, right? So importantly to note, the Safe and Sound Pro 2 meter that we use to do our readings only goes up to 2,500,000. So this is not really accurate because it could be more than this, and we just don't know because that's our meters maxed out at that point. So that's also really mind-blowing for my students. It's like, but they're like, what's the number? And I'm like, we just don't know. It's too high, right? So after our data gathering, Dr. Green is always kind enough to Zoom with my students, so I have them prepare some questions for her. She goes through a very similar presentation as she did so today with you all, and then they ask their questions, and then as it is an English assignment, I want them to write. So the first part of that is to write our lab report. Oh, real quick, these are some thank you notes from my students to Deborah. A lot of them are claiming that they no longer carry their cell phone in their pocket. I hope that's true, but I do still see a lot of cell phones in their pockets. But yes, so lots of impacts that I feel, and they still do remember this. I continue reinforcing it. I talk a lot about AI and tech and ChatGPT just as a teacher. Yes, question? I would like that to be the case again. So those are some thank yous. And then at my school, I don't know why, but I feel that this is just a general decline in writing across the curriculum, but they do not learn how to write a lab report ever in science. So last year I had graduating seniors who never wrote a lab report, don't know what's in a lab report, which I thought was crazy. So I taught them the parts of a lab report. I wrote the hard parts, and they wrote our results because we measured it all together, and then their hard task was the discussion, right? What does it mean? Why does it matter? So that was just some screenshots of what I gave them. These are then some of my letters that the students wrote to our county council members. They wrote one letter. We talked about how to write a business letter, how to format it, all of that kind of fun stuff. And then I printed 9 copies of the same letter to send to all our county council people. And it turned out to be over 300 letters, so I had to do a little donor's choose to get the money for all that postage, but it all worked out. It was, I hope it was fun for them getting all those letters to their office. So surprisingly, we actually did get 2 responses. If you read them, they're a tiny bit disappointing in their content, mostly thanking the students for engaging in the process and not really saying one way or the other whether they support it or not, but you know, politicians. But my students were quick to pick up on this, which I also appreciated. So these are some reflections that they wrote. They were really surprised that the council members actually responded because they were all like, no one's gonna write back. And I was like, we'll see. So we did get 2 back. But it was funny when they actually read it that they weren't really taking a stance one way or the other. But at the end of it, they were glad that they learned how to speak up, write letters, all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested, I do have a website. I don't know if I can launch it right now, but all of this is available on my website, my full PowerPoints, my full units. The exemplars that I felt were the best from the students are all on there, and anyone can go look at it for free, so it's all there. Yes, I don't know where the mouse is, but if you Google Sarah Mudrick, it might come up. Yeah, it should, if you click that website. Yes, okay, so it is on the advocacy tab, and there is a link at the top with all the stuff, because it's not just that, but If you click on the wireless radiation tab, it shows a lot of the things I just showed to you, but I put the full things like how I graded them so teachers could do the same. Get those rubrics. Here's them writing their lab report. This is what I just showed you again. All their thank yous. The questions that the students wrote to Deborah, if it loads. This is Deborah's full presentation with some of my student questions. Safe Tech Hawaii website. And then just my spiel in the beginning. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening.